Welcome, and we're so glad you're here for another mental health and wellness chat. I'm Brittany, and I'm here with
Madison,
and we're two of your VC Counseling Center counselors.
an associate.
And we're here to have real conversations about the emotional challenges that students face and explore navigating them. So today, we're going to jump into one of the most often misunderstood emotions. That's anger. So you've definitely felt it in your life, right? Maybe in the middle of an argument, when someone crosses a boundary, or during finals week stress. But anger isn't just about snapping or yelling. Anger is a really powerful emotion with deep biological roots, hidden layers, and believe it or not, a purpose. So in this episode, we're going to unpack what anger really is, what's happening in your brain and body when you do feel it, and why sometimes anger is just the tip of the iceberg. So we're going to look at some fascinating studies, cultural influences, and healthier ways to work with our anger rather than against it. So let's jump right into it. Madison, give us a definition of anger.
So, anger is an emotional state. It varies in intensity from mild irritation to intense fury or rage. And it's ultimately a response to a perceived threat or injustice. And it's really interesting to think of anger kind of as a continuum because we can jump to, oh, I'm at this huge, ball of rage. But really, it can start out as something as, irritation or annoyance and build up to frustration and then eventually get to that peak anger.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest things about anger is a lot of times people think that it's, oh, I was fine and then I wasn't. When we dig deeper into that, a lot of the times it becomes apparent that there is agitation, irritation, frustration, like you said, like a continuum that we either not aware of or we just flat out like suppress or ignore, and it builds until we get to that point that we do explode, which I think is where most people are like, that's anger, the explosion part of it.
Absolutely. And just the idea that it is a response to a perceived threat or injustice is so, when you think about it like that, it makes so much sense, right? We don't want any kind of threat to ourselves, to others who are important to us. And just, when things aren't fair, that's really hard for us to kind of comprehend and deal with. So it's understandable why anger results.
Yeah. I have to remind myself 100 times a day that life isn't actually fair, that is a illusion that my brain buys into, is that life has to be fair, things have to be fair, but ultimately there is no written rule anywhere in the universe that things are always going to be fair.
Exactly.
And I like that you bring that up. And I like to think of anger too as almost like, I have several metaphors for you. Get ready. It can be like a protective lid that covers emotions like fear, sadness, shame, loneliness, rejection, name any emotion, right? And we'll talk later. Madison will give us a really big breakdown of underlying emotions with anger. So we will get into that in further detail. But think of anger as the lid protecting those emotions. Or even anger is a smoke alarm too, right? So anger is very loud, alarming, apparent. But the anger is usually warning us of something else that's going on. Smoke alarm goes off because of smoke. It's warning you that fire is present or that fire could be present. So anger is kind of the same thing. So like a smoke alarm, sometimes it is a real fire, but other times it's just burnt toast. So the key is to like pause and assess the situation before we react, which we're going to spend a lot of time in today, is kind of recognizing the things that do trigger or start an anger cascade, which is one of the first steps of working with anger and exploring anger is, first of all, understanding, why am I even angry? What is contributing to this? Because a lot of times you might be surprised at what is fueling anger, and it might not even be the situation that you're in this moment. I'm sure that you can think back to any situation recently where you have surprised yourself with anger, or you've noticed that you're overreacting to something. This isn't about the fact that this letter won't tear. I did that this morning. I got frustrated because I was trying to open a letter, and I always go for you stack it on the table and then like everything moves to one end and then you rip that end off, because anytime I try to peel like the proper way, it never works and it always just shreds. But whenever I tried to peel the top today, the whole thing just shredded again. And then I ripped the letter. And it's not necessarily about that situation.
Yeah.
Yes, that is an agitating situation, but sometimes it's about things that are going on in our life, building up, leading to that frustration or anger response and taking it out on something that isn't necessarily the trigger, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think that is something that a lot of us might experience. And we might view that as someone kind of snapping or like, the last straw for someone, where it's something that seems so small scale, but whenever we have all these other things that have been building up or going on in our personal life, that kind of just feels like the last straw. And we do have that really intense emotional reaction that's not proportionate to what's going
Mhm.
on. And we know it's not rational, but that's just how it plays out
Yeah.
sometimes.
And this is the thing too, is that this is what we're getting at, is that anger tells us something very important. It's like,
Hmm.
hey, something is wrong here. What else is going on that I'm reacting so overtly to this very small thing? But it also doesn't mean that you have to act on it impulsively either, because that's the biggest thing with anger. It's typically an impulsive reaction, right? So something finally flips that switch and we have an impulsive reaction. I hear this a lot from people. They'll say, well, I got mad and I couldn't control it. I just started yelling, or I just punched that thing, or whatever it might be.
Hmm.
And it feels very impulsive. The whole process is very impulsive most of the time. Very rarely do I talk to anyone who is like, yes, I stand by my anger reaction in that moment. Usually we reflect on it. We say, okay, that's not the person I want to be, or I don't want to react in that way. I felt like I didn't have control in that moment. Um,
Right.
so that's an important thing to remember too, is that there is that component of impulsivity with anger.
Hmm.
And that's where people really take offense, because they're like, that's not who I want to be in this moment. So, and we can use anger to ask too, like, when I am angry, a lot of the times it's because a value is being violated. So asking, like, okay, is there a value that's being violated right now? What boundary has been crossed in this situation or with this thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I know we've touched on this before, but really emotions, all emotions are messengers. There's it's something it's trying to communicate to us. So being able to kind of cue into that and just get curious about it can be so helpful. And
Yeah.
just with the whole impulsivity thing, I think it's so important to recognize that like there is a space between, this stimulus, this trigger, whatever you want to call it, and our response. But it feels
Mhm.
really hard to take that pause, to take that space in the moment, just because that fight or flight that we're going to kind of get into here in a minute,
Yeah.
it makes everything feel so immediate.
Mhm.
So absolutely. So there is an evolutionary perspective whenever it comes to anger, because ultimately it evolved as a part of our fight or flight response. So that, motivates us to confront threats or unfairness. And, even in an ancestral environment, anger may have helped individuals protect resources or assert social boundaries, which I think is
Mhm.
super interesting
Yeah.
because, when we think back to prehistoric times, the dinosaurs were roaming, whatever you want to say to,
I love in
to
your world, like, dinosaurs and, like,
that's
cavemen are
that's
existing, like, together. That would be
oh
amazing.
my gosh, but cavemen, dinosaurs, whatever you want to use to imagine prehistoric times, like
Yeah.
yeah, resources like food, maybe a place to live, things like that were very scarce.
Mhm.
So, this instinctual response of fight or flight, our body is literally activating to kind of help protect against, like we said, these real or perceived threats to our safety, our
Mhm.
ability to continue to go on throughout life and carry on the bloodline, so to speak. It's a really
Yeah.
interesting concept, and it makes a lot of sense when you think about it in that capacity.
Yeah, and especially in life or death situations,
Yeah.
anger responses can be appropriate and beneficial because they can help with our survival and aid in our survival. And I think it's interesting to note here too the obvious difference, right? That especially in American culture and especially in men in American culture, anger has really become the only appropriate emotion for men to express. And it
Hmm.
frustrates me that we're here. I don't know how, I mean, I could write a dissertation on how we got
Hmm.
here, but ultimately it's very, anger is the most appropriate emotion for men to show. So I feel like a lot of times men lean towards anger and its components as the primary or only emotion. And sometimes this isn't even a conscious decision. It's something that they're socialized. I'm
Hmm.
obviously not a man, speaking from my understanding of men's experience in therapy and just, my husband and these things, having these conversations of, you know, whether it was explicitly or implicitly told to you, like, anger is the only appropriate way to express an emotion.
Hmm.
And a lot of times, especially our generation, what am I? Am I a millennial? Is that what I'm called? I think so.
I
I think
still
I'm
don't
a
know what I am
millennial.
either.
But at least in millennial culture, like, a lot of times most of our models, most of the masculine models in life express anger in a very violent or aggressive or verbally hostile way. So sometimes I've seen so many men that are stuck in this cycle of, I'm reacting to anger just like my father is, or just like my
Hmm.
father figure is. And that's not who I want to be, but I don't know how to choose different behaviors either
Right.
because it's just so automatic. But the thing is that through this process of primarily only displaying anger and really only unpacking anger, sadness, vulnerability that underlies that anger gets suppressed to the point that I've seen some men that are incapable of even identifying or putting words to what their emotional experiences are sometimes.
Wow, yeah.
So this is some of my favorite type of work to do in therapy is this specifically, but this is the problem though, and we see this a lot. I pick on men a lot, but and I'm going to continue to do that for this example, but the problem is that when we ignore anger and we don't investigate it, we don't work with it, we don't curiously explore it, sometimes this builds pressure. And that's where we see that explosion, right? So if I have 10 instances of micro anger throughout my day and I don't address them, I just kind of ignore them, push them down, push them to the side and move on. In the moment, it seems like, okay, well, this is good. I'm not getting angry. I'm just ignoring the things that are making me mad.
Mhm.
But like I said, it builds, 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 builds. And that's where we can see those explosions sometimes with people. So repressed
Absolutely.
anger, it does not disappear. It,
Yep.
it does. It builds up like you shake a soda can, right? Eventually, the pressure's going to find a way out. And when we cope with anger in this way, a lot of the times when the anger finds its way out, it comes out in an unhealthy or a disproportionate way where we're not acting in accordance with our values.
Absolutely. So much to unpack there. Like, it's so interesting because I think we've touched on this before as well. It's just specifically for men, there are messages that they are told growing up, there's models that they're observing as
Mhm.
children, and that just kind of becomes like their baseline of like, okay, this is what's normal. This is how you handle things, go about
Yeah.
things. And it becomes ingrained in them. And so being able to work with, men in counseling like that, you're able to unpack that, understand, how you got here and how
Mhm.
we can work towards uncovering those more vulnerable emotions. So
Yeah.
I absolutely love that.
Well, and I do want to note, I pick on men specifically with this issue though, because 90% of the men that come to therapy, at least with me, it is usually their presenting issue is I'm angry and I don't want to be angry anymore. So
Mhm.
can we unpack that and figure that out? And a lot of times as we start unpacking, we find so many things under there that are,
Right.
the anger is not the problem. The anger is a expression of the problem. The anger is the perceived solution to the problem, but the
Mhm.
anger itself isn't, I mean, yes, sometimes the anger itself and the reactions are a problem. But sometimes if we address whatever's under that, the anger just kind of self-resolves a lot of the times.
Mhm.
But that's to say not every time. Sometimes, yes, we do need to do anger specific work because we need to choose alternative behaviors when we are triggered or when we do get frustrated,
Right.
which we'll talk about here in a minute too.
Yeah. So now I just wanted to break down a few misconceptions about anger because it kind of gets a bad rap, but ultimately it's not inherently bad. Like we were saying, it's a signal, it's not a behavior. And it's important to remember that suppressing anger is not the same as managing it.
Yeah.
Like you said, if we continue to kind of stuff down our feelings, keep going through life without actually taking the time to acknowledge what's going on, get curious and process it, then yeah, we're going to eventually those feelings will peak and kind of come out in an, like you said, an
Yeah.
unhealthy way, reactive way. You know, I like the saying of like what we resist persists because it does. Like no matter what emotion we stuff down, we distract with, avoid from, it's going to come back up and it's usually going to be even more
Mhm.
overwhelming and powerful than it would be if we would have just took the time to kind of process it and explore it.
Yeah. And I like what you say. Anger is not inherently bad because it's not. I mean, there are times where it is absolutely appropriate
Oh
and
yeah.
beneficial and normal to feel anger, like when you've been wronged in some way. Like if
Mhm.
someone cheats on you, you have a right to be angry about that. If someone belittles you or is, sexist, discriminatory towards you, you have a right to anger about that situation.
Absolutely.
But I guess what we're picking on is the anger response
Mhm. Yes.
can be inherently bad depending on what it is. Now, obviously, I'm never going to condone hurting other people. Yes, if in your anger you lash out and you physically assault others, yes, that is bad. Do not do that. I think we can all agree, label that as such. The one-time therapists agree that things are bad. Yes,
Right.
like assaulting other human beings is bad. Screaming at people as your primary form of communication is bad. So I guess we pick more on the behavior. The response itself can absolutely be unhealthy and detrimental to your well-being, but the emotion of anger is not inherently a bad emotion. Sometimes it is appropriate. You can feel anger without assaulting people or breaking things, I guess is the goal at the end of the day.
Right. I always think it's not about the anger itself. It's always can be a valid emotion. It's more of what you do with that anger.
Yeah. So, really quick lesson in neurology, just to give you some background information. I promise I'll break this down in an easy to digest manner. But it's okay. What happens in our brain and body when we do get angry? And this is important to understand because it helps us create that space between the trigger and our reaction to anger. So, when our brain perceives a threat, I see a situation, whether that's someone cutting in line, a hostile text, personal insult, getting cut off in traffic, whatever. The amygdala, which is the part of your brain that detects fear and anger, it lights up, right? So this amygdala detects a threat and it initiates the emotional response. So through this process, your prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of your brain that's responsible for all of the higher order parts of you, logical thought, rationalization, your big smart thinking part of your brain, it regulates the amygdala's response. But the prefrontal cortex, whenever this process starts, it usually takes a back seat when we get intensely angry. So think about what I just said. The part of your brain that thinks rationally takes a back seat to this response. So maybe we're not thinking very rationally once this brain process starts. Your hypothalamus triggers your autonomic nervous system, which signals to the adrenal glands to release adrenaline and cortisol into your bloodstream. So once these chemicals are present, your body starts reacting, right? Your heart rate increases, blood pressure rises, maybe start getting sweaty, muscles tense, pupils dilate, and you start feeling that heat. And I'm glad we included this in this example because I feel that rush of heat,
Mm-hmm.
like in your chest,
Yes.
physically, emotionally, you feel hot in this moment. So all of this whole process that I just described happens within milliseconds, preparing you to either confront the situation or maybe escape the threat, whatever your reaction is. So this is why anger often feels so visceral and automatic, right? Your body's kind of getting hijacked before your rational brain, your prefrontal cortex, can step in and kind of regulate things and say, okay, who do I want to be today? Let me think about how I would like to respond in this situation. There's no time for that.
Yeah, that's such a great explanation. And whenever you're able to break it down like that, it makes so much sense because it ultimately is an instinctive survival response that our body is going through. And so, like you said, our higher order thinking brain, it goes offline. So we're not going to react how we would like to. And that's kind of
Mm-hmm.
funny because I think sometimes when people get angry, they have this huge response, this huge reaction to that we know is not rational, it's not proportionate to the situation. And then we kind of get that break to calm down and regulate, and our thinking brain comes back online. And then, usually get an apology from that person
Yeah.
because they're able to reflect and be like, hey, that wasn't me. That wasn't how I wanted to react. But in the moment, our brain, our physiology literally puts us into that state of being
Yeah.
so reactive.
And the interesting thing about this process too is when we get into certain types of neurodivergence like ADHD or other disorders that have trouble with emotional regulation, this whole process is turned up like times 10. So
Mm.
this is why you'll see people with ADHD have lower frustration tolerance, get angry faster than people that don't. And it's because this process in a normal neurotypical individual, there's a lot more self-regulation in there. There's a lot more like
Mm.
bumpers on the bowling alley lane, so to speak. Whereas with neurodivergence and some neurodivergencies, we see a lot less of that. So
Mm.
emotions are not only quicker to happen, but they're also much more intense whenever they do occur.
Oh my gosh, that makes sense. I also love that you just used a bowling alley metaphor.
I
That was great.
don't know where that came from. I
It
do not
worked.
bowl,
It
but
flowed
here
so
it
good.
is.
Oh my gosh. Okay. But another important way to think about things is just this is your hypothalamus being your body's emotional dispatch center. The moment that you feel that anger rising, it's the hypothalamus that's flipping all those switches, which, like we were
Like that
saying,
movie. What is that movie with the people inside of a brain?
Inside Out?
Yes, Inside
Oh,
Out. They're
yeah,
flipping all the
yeah.
switches.
Yes. And so, like we were saying, it can contribute to those physical responses, like your heart rate speeding up, your muscles start getting really tense, your system is just flooded with stress hormones. So it's your body's way of saying, okay, it's time to fight or time to flee. The problem is that most modern threats don't need, us fists to fight. Like they just
Mhm.
need self-awareness.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's also really interesting to note that in 2000 study, there was a study conducted that found that the amygdala becomes hyperactive during angry states while prefrontal activity diminishes. So this is all research backed in the sense of your prefrontal cortex, that rational part of you, has trouble completing its job and being rational when we are in this state of anger. So this is why a lot of times whenever you look at how do I manage my anger better, you'll see breathing techniques. And people always, give me a hard time about breathing techniques because they'll be like, this is stupid. How is breathing going to make me stop being angry? But the purpose of the breathing technique is rooted in the neuroscience here, right? So when we're in this state and our prefrontal cortex is not working, deep intentional breaths can help relax this automatic response, and it can bring your prefrontal cortex back online. So even if it's just 5 intentional long deep breaths, we can activate our opposing nervous system to start getting into a physical state of relaxation, which if we can relax our physical body, then you can't be angry in a relaxed body, is why we do this. Because I hear you, I understand you do not want the breathing technique, but just let me say that as to why we always recommend and start there,
I know they are so common to be recommended, but they genuinely do work and they help activate that relaxation response that we're trying to combat whenever the stress response does kind of take over us. So absolutely. Yeah.
So why do we feel anger? Well, we could list these all day. We're just going to give some common ones that we see. One of the biggest ones is a perception of injustice or violation. So usually we feel anger when we or someone we care about has been wronged. Now, I include perception here for a reason. It's just a perceived wrong. That doesn't mean that I actually was harmed or wronged in some way. I just perceive that I'm either going to be harmed or that I have been harmed. And I'm getting counselory and picky here because, obviously we can feel anger when we feel like we got ripped off, but then we go do research later and we're like, oh no, I didn't actually get ripped off. I'm sorry that I was mad about that. So perception does play a role in this. And I guess that's a point that I want to drive home.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we've said before, whether it's a genuine threat or something that's perceived, the reaction can be the same, so it makes a lot of sense. But then whenever we're able to reflect back on it, it's like, okay, I just blew that out of proportion. But in the moment, it's hard to recognize that, Absolutely. Another reason we can feel anger is because we have blocked goals. Anger can emerge when progress is impeded. So, examples could be deadlines, social conflicts. Whenever we have something that's kind of standing in our way, it can be a really frustrating thing to experience. I was actually reading up on something. I saw an example of when you're waiting in a line at the movie theater. That can be a really frustrating experience. I've had this happen to me, and it's like, our goal is to get the popcorn and the drinks. And if we're in line for 30 minutes, then that's being blocked ultimately. It's a silly example, but it's so true.
Yeah, I thought that you were going for the stereotypical, have you seen how aggressive and serious people take lines in general? I know it's a joke about the UK, but I feel like as Americans, we do the same exact thing. We're like, I've literally heard people behind me and cutting in line ahead. I'm being dramatic, but people get
so true.
very agitated whenever you cut in line or people do what they're not supposed to. So yeah, absolutely.
Right. Learned responses are also a big reason why we feel anger. Our childhood experiences can shape our anger templates, and that's basically how we express or suppress it. If you were a child who experienced a lot of anger growing up, and maybe that was dismissed or criticized or whatever it may be, you kind of learn okay, this isn't safe for me to express this. So I'm just going to keep it all bottled up inside or, internalize it. And that can be really hard for someone because they go throughout life not knowing how to navigate that in healthy ways.
Well, and the opposite can be said too. Even I've had people in situations where anger was never acknowledged or expressed, or they were punished for being angry.
Okay, yeah.
And so sometimes we learn that we cannot express anger because we're going to be punished in some way for it. So they never really develop a tool or get any practice in managing their anger. So we end up just suppressing it 24/7 and just never actually even acknowledging it.
Right.
And like we said earlier, the example about, if all of my role models or adult parental figures in my life were excessively angry and violent when they were angry, I see that going two ways a lot of times with people. Either people will be like, I am never going to react that way. And they develop the tools in resistance to that. Or sometimes we get put in very stressful situations and then they end up reacting in a similar way. So then there's a lot of guilt and shame because I've, become the thing that I never wanted to become. So it gets pretty messy. Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard whenever you end up repeating those same patterns that maybe caused you so much, fear and, anxiety and uncomfortableness. Absolutely.
Yeah. And another important thing to look at here is the cultural influence. So here in the United States, obviously, we're a very individualistic culture. And a lot of studies have been done to say that in individualistic cultures, sometimes anger is viewed as a sign of personal boundaries or strength, right? And I feel like this is unique to men specifically. I feel like as a woman, in American culture, being angry or um, having anger isn't necessarily a sign of boundaries or strength. It's a sign of, it's a negative perspective. It's a negative thing as a woman to
It
express
is.
and show anger, judged
Mhm.
more harshly than maybe men are a lot of the times.
For sure.
Whereas for men, yes, being able to get angry or be scary or raise your voice to that, big boy voice, so to
Mhm.
speak, can be seen as a sign of boundaries or strength in some way. Um, so, okay, enough background information. Let's move into why you're here in the first place, right? How do we work with anger rather than against it? Well, we're going to go through a lot of different things here, of different things that we typically review with people and just some basic stuff. Obviously, not therapy, not a substitute for therapy, but name it to tame it is a big one, right? So, being able, like we were talking about earlier, being able to recognize the early signs that we get anger before we get to the explosion phase is a big part. So, one way to do that is to become more aware of our emotional states throughout the day and all the time, and especially when we are triggered. So, labeling emotions, the process of stopping and saying, okay, I'm feeling something. What is it? Anxiety, sadness, vulnerability, guilt, shame, whatever. That process of forcing yourself to stop and put a name to an emotion engages our prefrontal cortex, which, like we talked about earlier, remember, if we can get our prefrontal cortex online, we are less likely to have an impulsive, emotional, anger based
Mhm.
response. So it's important to be able, and the thing is when you first start doing this, people always come to me and they say, this is so weird. Like, am I really gonna have to do this for the rest of my life? Like, stop, take a breath, pause. Like, it takes time, and we don't, we hate spending time on these things. But
Yeah.
ultimately, the more we practice, the more automatic it does become. But
Mhm.
yes, when we become emotional, the thing is, when you become emotional, that whole neurological cycle we talked about earlier occurs, which
Yeah.
means what? Once again, it means that we're not going to have our prefrontal cortex online to label these emotions. So, yes, when we're emotional, you are going to have to stop and think this through, and it is going to take time every time that you get emotional, probably. So, this is just one of those skills that it does take continuous, constant monitoring and practice all the time to really be effective.
Absolutely. We always go back to just awareness and just really looking into those warning signs because while it can feel so immediate and like there's nothing you can do between, whatever triggered this anger and your response, like whenever we look back at it, there is always
Mhm.
something that we can do. And just being able to get our higher order thinking brain back online, it can make such a difference in the way simple, but it really makes such a huge difference. Another, important concept that we like to discuss whenever addressing anger is the idea of this anger iceberg, right? So this is something that's coined by the Gottman Institute. And the anger iceberg, it's a visual tool that illustrates how anger is just the visible tip, while other vulnerable emotions lie beneath the surface. And anger ultimately can feel safer or more powerful than emotions like, hurt, shame, fear, guilt, loneliness, anxiety. So, like an iceberg, what's visible is just a small part of the whole story. This,
Yeah, and I would definitely Google a picture of this too. It'll take
yes.
2 seconds to switch over to the other browser, Google anger iceberg. That's all you need to see. And you can see the tip is the anger, and then there's the water line under the anger, and then this giant iceberg underneath
Hmm.
with a billion different emotions on it.
Yes, it's such a valuable strategy. And like we were touching on earlier, it really does show you how anger is ultimately just protecting us from more vulnerable emotions that feel
Yeah.
harder to access, harder to express. So it's an amazing tool to use.
And one of the goals of therapy is to start recognizing, labeling, and learning to attach the word with the emotion of those more vulnerable emotions. Because the argument and the theory here is that if we address those primary emotions underneath the surface, then the anger will be significantly impacted. It'll be lessened, might not even have nearly as many anger problems ultimately. Hopefully is the goal, but not always. So yeah, this is the big thing. And I'll literally hand this to people sometimes depending where they're at and say, like, okay, look at this picture with this iceberg and these emotions listed. Which one of these best describes what you feel like you were feeling in that
Hmm.
moment? And it does take some digging and self-reflection to say, okay, maybe I was feeling guilt for the things that I've done in the past. And maybe that's why I was so overwhelmingly angry in that moment.
Yeah. And whenever you're able to make that realization, like, oh, maybe this is actually what I'm feeling, it can be huge and so insightful.
So, why do we default to anger in these situations? Well, I mean, there's a lot of potential explanations. I get this question a lot. Anger is more socially acceptable in many cultures, especially for men, like we've been talking about earlier, while vulnerability can be perceived as weak depending on the culture and the context that we're in. So, sometimes anger is just the most socially acceptable way for us to react in a moment. Anger always also gives us this false sense of control over a situation that, even when I can't do anything, I can still get angry and respond in anger. Um, and as humans, we love feeling like we're in control. So sometimes
Mhm.
anger can give us that illusion. And then sometimes the fight or flight wiring in our brain can make anger a fast acting emotional shield, so to speak. So I see this a lot in arguments and in couples therapy, right? We'll be getting close to addressing something that is very raw, something that is very vulnerable, or maybe something that someone might feel guilt or shame over. And the partner reacts in anger in that moment. Now, if we zoom out and we look at this from a therapist perspective, what's happening in this moment? Well, we're getting distracted from addressing the actual issue, which addressing the actual issue will probably be uncomfortable and painful and may make me feel guilt, shame, any number of negative emotions. So it's an automatic process almost to avoid it in a sense, where if
Mhm.
I'm getting angry, now we're going to argue about me being angry. We're not going to talk about that uncomfortable thing. And I
Right.
can kind of distract here from the actual issue and instead argue about what I'm saying or argue about arguing or arguing for argument's sake. So anger can absolutely serve a function.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily a healthy function, but it does shield me from feeling that uncomfortable, painful, vulnerable emotion in that moment.
Right. It definitely has a protective response. And I think it all just goes back to some emotions are so difficult to sit with and to talk about. And, it's understandable why it feels like that. And that we kind of use that anger to cover up
Yeah.
those more vulnerable and difficult emotions to talk about. So that's so true. Another reason that we default to anger is because people often mislabel or avoid underlying emotions due to discomfort, especially in emotionally intense moments. I think you just gave like a perfect example of that,
Yeah.
honestly. Like it doesn't feel like I can access, that guilt, that shame, whatever it is. So I'm going to just resort to anger because like you said, that gives me that sense of control.
Yeah.
So true, And in therapy, identifying underlying emotions under anger often leads to faster emotional resolution and stronger relationship repair, which is something that you, I think, talked about earlier.
Yeah.
When we can uncover what's beneath those emotions, it can help us, like we said, respond rather than react.
Yeah. And a good point of reflection here, piece of homework here is, next time that you feel angry, or even if you reflect back to the last time that you were particularly angry, pause and ask yourself, what am I really feeling underneath this, beneath this? What is under my iceberg? Because, like, we're going to keep driving this point home today that, the theme today is becoming aware of those primary negative emotional experiences that are happening underneath this anger. Anger is a very intense feeling that is very explosive. What is that quieter emotion underneath it? Is it guilt, shame? Is it fear? Is it anxiety? Is it worry? What is underneath
Mhm.
that? It can literally be anything. And this is part of even, there's lots of different treatment and options whenever you look into therapy and strategies and techniques for anger. But another one is mindfully engaging anger. So mindfulness based stress reduction, MBSR, can absolutely help emotional reactivity. There's been lots of studies done to investigate the effect that this can have. And with this strategy, really, a therapist would help you integrate components of mindfulness specifically towards anger and in anger situations to be able to develop some coping skills to be able to regulate anger a little bit more productively for you.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And another great strategy is cognitive reframing. So there's so many CBT techniques out there that teach us to challenge the thoughts that are fueling our anger. Like we said, we are not thinking rationally, we're not thinking clearly whenever we are overwhelmed by anger. So whenever we get into like a counseling setting, this gives us the space to kind of really dive deeper into maybe those thoughts that are contributing to the anger responses and break them down and challenge them. Like ask myself, is there any other explanations for this? Like, is there any evidence for this? Is this in my
Yeah.
control or out of my control? Being able to take that time to not just accept every single thought that we have as fact and something that I need to lock into can be so helpful for managing that anger more effectively.
And my favorite example to give people with this is most people get agitated in traffic or when they get cut off or like people are
Mhm.
driving stupid, right?
Yes,
So
so true.
one great way to practice this is the next time you get cut off or something stupid happens while you're driving and you get frustrated, I want you to ask yourself and come up with as many explanations as you can for why that other person or that car did what they did that do
Mhm.
not lead to anger for you. So, an example is like maybe they're in a medical emergency and
Yeah.
they're trying to get to the hospital as quickly as possible. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe they weren't paying attention. Maybe they were playing on their phone, whatever it might be. But the goal is to come up with as many explanations for what they did that are innocent or innocuous,
Mhm.
not that they're stupid or they don't know how to drive or things that are going to anger you, if that makes sense.
Right. It's so easy to kind of find an explanation that makes it personal to ourselves, but whenever we have that chance to be like, or maybe this
Mhm.
happened, it can kind of help
Yeah.
us calm down and not get down that, spiral of anger. So absolutely.
And other popular ways to cope with anger too are just healthier alternative outlets, right? So, physical activity is a really good one.
Yes.
Creative expression can also be another really good one. And given that anger exists on such a emotional part of our brain, physical activity, creative expression can really help us work through those emotions without, obviously, it's a much less aggressive means. And, practicing assertive communication, not passive aggressive or aggressive reactions, all of these things are kind of getting into the realm of like formal therapy at this point where it becomes very individualized to be able to come up with strategies and techniques for
Mhm.
these things. But I do want to echo here, when anger becomes problematic and it's frequent, intense, or it harms your relationships or you're physically harming others, this is a
Mhm.
really good signal for me that professional counseling would be appropriate for these situations.
Right.
If you're breaking property, if this becomes a pattern of behavior, obviously, we're experiencing negative life consequences because
Mhm.
of my anger. So I would
Yes.
always recommend professional counseling in those instances. It's important to remember too, I mean, anger is loud, it is, but what's underneath it is often much quieter, but it's also more honest. So, when we explore the iceberg, we can open the door to deeper self understanding, healthier communication, and more satisfying relationships ultimately. And we're living in a more authentic self in those moments too. We're becoming more connected with our emotional experiences. Just because we ignore our emotional experiences does not mean that you do not have them. They're still
Right.
there, they still exist. We're just choosing to ignore them.
Yes, absolutely. And just to kind of echo what you said, anger issues, difficulties managing your anger is so real and it can really have so many negative impacts on you, your relationships, the way that you show up for different environments. And yeah, and it's important to kind of reflect on that and say, are things getting too out of control? Am I in this state too frequently? Maybe that is your kind of signal to reach out for help and look into some alternative options, because you just being able to go over a few options here in this episode, it shows you that there are so many things that we can do.
Mhm.
We don't have to be stuck in this reactive mode, this feeling that everything is so urgent and I have to be so explosive all the time. So
Yeah.
it's just remembering that there are so many things that you can do to get back on track and respond in more healthy ways. Absolutely. So I really enjoyed this episode. I think this is a great topic. I hope a lot of our listeners will be able to relate and hopefully learn something new from it. So, thanks for joining us today on your go to space for honest conversations about mental health and well being. We're your hosts, Madison,
And Brittany.
and we're glad that you spent part of your day with us. Remember that taking care of your mind is just as important as taking care of your body. Be kind to yourself, reach out if you need support, and know that you're never alone. Until next time, take care and take a deep breath.